Okay, welcome to this episode of Better Buildings for Humans, where we talk about the way that the built environment impacts our health, our wellness, our productivity, and of course, our joy. And we always talk about sustainable design as well. Today, we have a very special guest. James Garrett Jr. is with us. James Garrett is a brilliant practitioner in the world of architecture, and it is an absolute honor to have him on the show here today. Thanks for being here, James.
Thank you, Joe. Appreciate it.
Of course, of course. So let's begin with having you tell us about your background, how you became an architect, the kind of projects that inspire you, and of course, some of the things that you're working on today.
Yeah, well, my journey is, I think, maybe a non-traditional journey. I was born on a small Caribbean island called St. Thomas in a town called Charlotte Amalia to two American parents who had sort of expatted in the late 60s, early 70s, and decided to start anew. We came back when I was little and settled in my mom's hometown of St. Paul, Minnesota. So I went from Caribbean beach baby to child of the frigid North, literally overnight one night. And, so I began my journey towards, I think, a fascination with cities and people. And one of the things that really led me to the path of architecture, I think I was maybe 5 or 6 years old, was Legos. So I was a Lego maniac, and I was constantly with any of my free time. If I wasn't outside playing sports and running around with my friends, I was, in my room, under my bed, making stuff with Legos. I was making entire cities and, yeah, it was crazy. And so I think I started on that path back then. So I was probably 5 or 6 years old when I decided that whatever this thing is, with all the making stuff and the buildings and the people, I think that's what I want to do. And so I kind of knew right away. And I was about maybe 12 years old when the Olympics came to Los Angeles. And we have a lot of relatives out in California. And so we were out visiting, and we went to go see like the Olympic marathon and some of the free stuff that you do. And my parents discovered a sketchbook, and I had sketched all manner and variety of buildings and cities, and I had the heights of all these different skyscrapers noted. And I don't know how I did all this research back then, pre-internet, but I just, was fascinated and obsessed with buildings. And so when we got back, my parents really started to lean into that, and they took us to Chicago, and I got a chance to road trip with my family and go to the top of the Sears Tower and the John Hancock building. And, they bought me a Chicago architecture book while I was there. And, I was in heaven. And so I had drawn and sketched all the buildings in the Twin Cities. And so, they wanted to take me to a bigger city to continue to expand my imagination and my thought process. And so if there was any doubt at that point, it was all erased, I think, for my family, that this was the path that I was going to go down. And so I proceeded down that path. I started out at the University of California at Berkeley, studying architecture with really an emphasis on urban housing and affordable housing and multifamily housing. And I spent some time at Arizona State University. I spent 3 semesters there studying architecture, landscape architecture, and city planning. And I came back to Berkeley with this sort of new combination of skills and interests, and, things just started to really, blossom and flow. And I graduated in 1995, moved back to the Twin Cities to work. Ultimately, I continued on to my master's degree at Parsons School of Design in New York City, where I really looked at, urban housing and real estate development. And I started really doing a lot of writing. I had always done a lot of writing, but I think at Parsons, I was really pushed to write. And so I started to write about hip hop and architecture. I started to just really start focusing on sort of cultural expressions of three-dimensional space and how that was something that our cities were sorely lacking. And I think I made a decision then that the rest of my career would be really dedicated to sort of reinvigorating the urban environment and really injecting elements of culture and art and, really flourishes of creativity in the spaces that had become very sort of banal and boring and disinteresting in sort of the post World War II environment. So I think that's where it all kind of came together. I was licensed in New York first, and then licensed in Minnesota, and then ultimately in New Jersey as well. And, we really opened up our practice here, 2002, my partner Eric and I. We added Nathan in 2007 when we were awarded a contract to design stations on the Green Line light rail. And I think that really catapulted us and boosted us into out of obscurity and sort of into the game. And so we've been very fortunate. 22 years we'll celebrate here coming up in July of, adding colorful, culturally significant work to the urban environment.
I love it. You were born for this. You were absolutely born for this.
Literally.
Yeah, that's really cool. So many of us stumbled into our careers, but you were you were sure at such a young age. That's absolutely marvelous. All right, I want to talk about music a little bit. I'm going to start with a quote that I read from you, or a quote that you quoted in an interview with Beyond the Built Environment. You quote Charles Mingus. Anyone can make the simple complicated. Creativity is making the complicated simple. Okay, I love that quote. And I love Charles Mingus too. But anyway, I would love to hear you share, maybe with a couple of examples, how that quote applies in architecture.
Yeah, well, I think we've gone back and forth through all these different, post-war sort of phases of architecture. One of the ones that I was really fascinated with early on was postmodernism, and sort of the irreverence of postmodernism, but I couldn't take the actual building seriously. So I really appreciated the writing and the way that architects were speaking in sort of an irreverent way about sort of being stuck in very traditional forms of architecture. And so that sort of resonated with me as a young student and practitioner. But it started to manifest itself in buildings that were kind of weird. The proportions, the dimensions, they weren't visually sort of appealing from my visual artist's standpoint. They lacked sort of the asymmetrical balance and composition and rhythm and all those sort of visual sort of things that I'm attracted to and gravitate to in art, in music, in science, quite frankly. And so they started to kind of become a joke. And so I kind of went from there and I started to really study what was going on with, there's the deconstructivist movement, and that sort of captured my interest for a while because purely from a formal and compositional standpoint, it was starting to ask different questions. It was starting to go in different directions than typical architecture. And so I really became a fan of a number of architects that were sort of working in that space. I think from there, I sort of started to look at those structures that they were actually producing, because for a long time, it was paper architecture, right? We were going through a lull in the 80s and 90s here in the economy. There wasn't as much construction really happening. And a lot of this stuff was theory. It was coming out of sort of the ivory tower, right? It was theoretical architecture, the forms, the shapes. I think Coop Himmelblau and some of the folks in Dutch architecture, I think, were the first to start actually building some of these forms. And I really became a fan of, there were several architects, I think, that really caught my eye and started to build buildings. I started to believe that the buildings at Coop Himmelblau and some of the European folks that were, on the cutting edge they were building buildings that were really difficult to occupy. So they started to be unattractive to me in the sense that, okay, from a visual standpoint, these things that are being designed, they have this energy, this dynamism, but from a functionality standpoint, they can never be anything other than what they were. And so, what they were initially designed to be. And so I started thinking further down in the future, who's going to inherit these buildings? How are cities going to operate with the leaf-skinned building with the super sharp angles and, all these things. And so at that point, Morphosis and Tom Main started to really come into my view. To me, they were executing some of these dynamic, sort of non-traditional structures, but they felt inherently inhabitable in a way that made sense to me from sort of an urban longevity standpoint. Like, these buildings could become other things in the future, as the city continues to evolve, as this particular client, maybe passes on or sells a business or moves into something else. The city could reincorporate and re-embrace these buildings, and I could see them functioning, far into the future. And to me, that was really interesting. And I started to listen to Tom Main speak, and I started to really start to think about this in context. And I said, okay, now here's a place where I feel like, I can start to intervene. And really, for me, I think going to Parsons during that time in around, the early 2000s, there was a lot of exploration, experimentation that I was encouraged to do there. And I had a lot of professors who were really, I think, on the cutting edge in that moment. Shop architects, Sharples, Holden, Pasquarelli. Bill Sharples was, a really amazing professor. Learned a ton from him. He really pushed me. He challenged me to get out of my comfort zone and to start to really experiment with how I embrace space. I think there was something sort of holding me back. Low Tech, Adatola and Giuseppe Logano, amazing practitioners doing a lot with technology and sort of retro technology, playing sort of futuristic roles. So almost going back to the future with some of their forms and some of the things that they were playing with, and taking their studios and spending time with them started to really influence me. And I would say Louis Suramaki Lewis as well, taking their courses and visiting some of their buildings and going to see their workshop, when it was in Chinatown, was just a really mind-expanding experience for me. And I think being in New York at that time, I think the influences that I was studying, that I was looking at, and then just being in New York City with sort of remnants of the jazz culture, being able to go uptown and still hear live jazz music, being where hip hop was born, spending a lot of time in the Bronx with Tat's crew, BG 183, Bio, Nicer, a lot of the graph writers. There was all these different influences. And I think I took that back to Minnesota and really started to explore some things on my own. And so I think it was a combination of, bebop, jazz, and then the next generation of bebop, which essentially was hip hop. The children of a lot of the jazz musicians, like Oludara, son Nas, is my age, and he's an MC. And so between the writers and the MCs and the DJs, a lot of them were sons of this sort of revolutionary jazz era. And so I started to really study that, like, where did the people that created us come from and what were their influences? And so I started to, again, start to interact with the retro moving forward into the future. Again, sort of like what low tech was doing with buildings in the built form. I was starting to think through that in my theory and the way that I saw architecture.
Oh, I love that. Love that. Okay. Let's stay on that role. So music is an inspiration for your designs. You've spoken about that in the past. Can you elaborate on that specifically? Like, is there a way to put into words the experience of music inspiring, a physical design?
Yeah, and I think a lot of architects have struggled with that and wrestled with that. I know Van Gogh talked about how architecture is frozen music. And to me, that really resonated because I think of like these notes as sort of these three-dimensional sonic waves sort of moving out in time and space, and sort of freezing them into place starts to create sort of forms and objects in the environment. What do frozen sound waves look like? What do they feel like? What are they, how do you experience them? And so I started to really, I think, write about some of these connections. One of the big connections was I discovered an old video called Beneath the Underdog, and it was Charles Mingus, really a retrospective of Charles Mingus with a lot of period interviews from the 50s on and into the 70s. And one of the interviews that he did with his drummer, Danny Richmond, in the early 70s, really resonated with me. And he really talked about, or Danny Richmond was telling the story with Mingus sitting next to him. And Danny Richmond was a lot younger than Mingus. He was from sort of the next generation, and he was a drummer. And so he was a teenage kid who was super talented, and he was really trying to prove himself to Mingus and, these very assertive, big personalities, jazz personalities that he was having the luxury of playing with. And so he was doing all these riffs and all these fills and all these very fancy sort of, drum tricks. And he said that one day Mingus just pulled him aside and he said, "Look, man, like, I dig what you're doing and everything. We know that you have the talent. We know that you have the skill. That's why you're here with us. But all this excessive filling and all this sort of like, jazz is a conversation." He said, "Hello, how are you?" And then you pause and you give the opportunity for someone to respond, the audience, to respond. And then you say, "My name is Charles," or, it's a conversation. It's a dialogue. It's two ways. It's not just one way, like, just doing every single skill that you've ever learned all at once. And so that kind of goes back to what he had said previously in the 50s about sort of making the complex simple, right? So anybody who has skills can just do a whole bunch of stuff. But it's the genius that can take those skills and know when the proper moment to apply them, when to pause, when to give space, when to enter, when to fall back, how to engage in this dialogue. And so to me, I started to really think about not just frozen music in the sense that it's just this physical thing, but it's also this dance, right? It's this opportunity to lead and then follow and then fall back and then pause and then breathe. And it's a dance. It's an interaction. And I really wanted to think about physical manifestations of that. So I started to think, how do people sort of approach a building or a place or a space, right? What do they see? What captures their attention visually as a visual artist? I'm thinking compositionally. What do people see as they approach a space? What prompts them to want to approach it and to enter it? What do they see when they get there? What invites them in, right? What tells them, sort of gives them visual cues how the space is organized, how to orient themselves, how to sort of enter the space, how to understand the space that they're going into as they're sort of going into it. Are there visual cues? And I started to think about this line theory, and I started to think about what Mingus was talking about. I started to think about what Van Gogh was talking about. And then I started to think about the experiential aspect of entering into a space. Well, acknowledging that the space exists, then being drawn into that space. And then once you get into that space, are there visual cues architecturally that can start to lead people so that they can circumambulate that space and understand it physically without necessarily having to read a bunch of signage, right? They may speak a different language. They may, they may have, some visual impairment, but how do you create a space that sort of invites people in, it announces its presence, invites people in, and then leads them through? And so I started to think about this continuous line and like how I want people to come in and explore and be able to move freely. And so I started to think about sort of connecting these lines three-dimensionally and these imaginary lines that don't exist, but creating a three-dimensional expression of them. So it kind of starts with the signage. It starts with announcing itself. And then this presence at the entry starts to sort of unfold. And there's these architectural experiences that welcome you in, help orient you, help you turn around. You're kind of seeing how things flow. There's artistic flourishes and things from sort of the Art Deco era that start to welcome you and orient you. And so I'm starting to think like retrospectively about sort of hip hop, and then the generation before hip hop being bebop, and then the generation before that being, Art Deco and sort of the jazz age and all of those things. So I'm connecting like the 30s, the 50s, and then the 70s through music and through this sort of experiential comprehension of three-dimensional space. And so that is what I've literally been exploring since I left New York City in, the mid 2000s. And that is really what us as a practice, as formula, that's kind of the three fundamental pillars of our practice are sustainability, technology, and art. So those three things and how they interact with the human experience of, entering into and sort of understanding space, those have been the things that we've been exploring. So using light, using texture, using color, being very specific, working very closely with other visual artists and creating visual art that adds the flourishes and the things that sort of touch the human spirit in a way that, just a blank canvas sort of can't really do, right? And so I love minimalism. I appreciate the smooth lines. Again, I go back to Art Deco and some of the smooth lines and surfaces, but then there's always these flourishes that sort of reward the senses. When you sort of approach the entry to a building, it tells a story. When you go to the elevators, it tells a story. There's these embossed metal panels that tell you the history of what in the aspiration of what this client thinks about the world. And you enter in and there's these little details and nuggets that you take with you in the visual environment that completely left after World War II. They were completely sort of sanitized out of the built environment. And I felt like, what is a 21st century way to bring those back? And so some of the technologies that we have are different, right? We don't have the stone carvers and the craftspeople that can do beautiful terracotta details and flourishes anymore, right? But we do have amazing building panelization, right? We have customizable panels, especially metal panels. You can do almost anything with them nowadays. In terms of three-dimensionally, in terms of perforating, in terms of you can start to create like real like art again, but it's different, right? So how do we take the things that we have in the modern era, in our current era, and how do we start to work with artists again and bring back that sense of wonder and amazement and sort of just visual and spatial engagement? And so working with light. I mean, we have incredible LED technology now. The costs on it have come way down. Again, panelized systems, all of these sort of metal tooling and metal forming systems that we have now. So we do have a palette, but it's a different palette. But we can still sort of continue that tradition of really engaging, the user and really challenging their senses and giving them something that's a memorable experience and something that they can feel good about being in space again.
That was wonderful. What a wonderful answer. I want to keep sort of on that pathway a little bit and talk about, the focus of this program, which is occupant comfort and wellness, or just basically designing for the human occupants. Let's pick a project. Let's say the Great River Landing, right? How did the needs of the occupants play into that design?
Well, Great River Landing is a great example because, for a number of factors. I think the biggest factor is that, Great River Landing was a project that was really necessary in our community. It really serves ex-offenders, folks who have been homeless or at risk of homelessness due to prior incarceration. And it's a population that oftentimes ends up on the street. And, recidivism often takes place when people don't have the resources to be able to really make that comeback and really reenter society in a meaningful way. And one of the things that we wanted to do with that project was we wanted to really engage the users in a way that they've probably never been engaged in their lives. Part of the reason why they had issues and trouble with the law a lot of times was they've never been listened to. It's a population it's a silent population that makes noise in order to sort of survive. One of the things that we wanted to do was start right away with a stakeholder engagement sort of platform. So we proposed with Roger Cummings from Juxtaposition Arts in Minneapolis, who's one of my high school friends, one of my longtime friends, and really one of the best artists that the Twin Cities has. We worked very specifically on creating an engagement program where we would get to know the men in the program that would potentially be living in this space. We wanted to really understand what their hopes and fears and challenges and what their aspirations were in a way that no one had ever really taken the time to understand that. And so we created a series of 2-hour engagement sessions where Roger led sort of these art-based engagement sessions. They built things, they made things, they were creative, they colored, they did found object sculptures, and most importantly, as they were sort of engaging in these activities together, they talked. And I had specific questions that I would have Roger sort of introduce during the course of these sessions. And part of the conversation was, what does love feel like to people who have been unloved, right? What does family mean to people who have been separated for sometimes decades from their biological families, right? What does belonging feel like to people who have been sort of cut out of society for, 10, 20 or more years? How do these things factor? How do these things function? And we started to really explore some deep concepts. And we had these series of interactions for several months during the process. So it wasn't just, hold your hand up for a survey or, some corny BS like that. We really wanted to build a relationship and get to know what was going on in these men's lives so that we could build supportive architecture that sort of helps lift them back up. And one of the things that we really found through this engagement session, which was not necessarily popular by, the client, they're used to us engaging them, right? The check writer. The check writer is used to being the center of everything because they have the money. Well, we wanted to sort of elevate the people that are actually going to be living and working and sort of existing in this space. We wanted to elevate them up to the same level that the check writer was, right? So as typical engagement would engage the check writer over and over and over, we wanted to engage the check writer, but for every meeting we had with the check writer, we want to have 5 to 10 meetings with the people that were actually on the ground and were going to be living there. And we're going to be affecting their daily lives. And one of the things that we learned, one of the first things that we learned is that over and over and over, these guys mentioned their children. And so doing some research, we started to understand that the number one way to fight recidivism is to reconnect people with their families. So when guys come home and they're connected with their kids and they can see that hope and that need that they're needed in their kids' lives, and it really is a motivation for them to stay on the straight and narrow and to buckle down and to focus and to really they have that connection to that next generation. And so the guys kept talking about their kids every single session. So we realized this is a family building. This isn't about these men. This is about families and reuniting families and creating spaces for families to be together. So that completely changes the thrust and the impetus of the architecture then, right? So we were early enough in the design process. We did this engagement parallel with schematic design. So we were still sort of pushing and pulling and tweaking things. And so when we started to get this information, I said, well, you know what? We can take 16 inches out of the width of every apartment on the second floor. And then all of a sudden now we've got a room that's wide enough that it can be a children's room, right? So we created this children's room on the second floor where guys could have supervised visitation with their kids, brightly colored walls. We did something special with the lighting. We donated our company formula. We donated a bunch of board games and toys and books and things like that. And we created this environment for kids. We've got the little tiny chairs and the middle-sized chairs and the big chairs. So, everything's family scale and colorful. And all of a sudden now we had a space where people could interact with their kids that the kids wanted to come to, that they thought it was fun. They couldn't wait to see dad again and be in this environment. And so we carried that outside as well. One of the things that had been given to us in the program was that, we have to put a basketball court in the back of this building. We're thinking a basketball court, like, why would we put a basketball court? And it was like, oh, well, these guys, they play basketball in prison, a lot of them. And we're like, these guys aren't trying to be Michael Jordan, man. There's no LeBron Jameses here, right? A lot of times guys play sports or do activities, whatever, to keep themselves sane, to blow off some of the stress and the energy. They're not trying to be professional basketball players. Basketball isn't what's important to them. What's important is that they have a chance to exercise some of the stress that's building up from their incarceration. So I'm like, why would we forcibly put something that reminds them of their prior incarceration and centralize that in this space? I was like, that's the goofiest, thing that I've ever heard of. So we said we were going to scrap that basketball court idea and we were going to put a children's area back there. We got a little jungle gym. We had a little grass area. They could kick a soccer ball, throw a football around. Kids can climb around and tool around and sort of be themselves and have fun. And so we also added an outdoor patio area where they have grills and stuff. And so you can get together. Food is important. You can cook out, bring your family together and, do that together. So we created spaces that were family oriented spaces in a building that was supposed to be for, quote, homeless men, right? Homeless ex-offenders. And so we did a number of things to really inject some love and some compassion into a space that folks had not necessarily had the opportunity to experience before. One of the other things that I think was important is that we worked with Roger very closely then to, as he gathered this information and had these conversations, he would start sketching and he would sort of sketch from each meeting what it was feeling like and these different concepts that were talked about. And he had these really beautiful sketches. And so we started to create visual art out of those sketches. And then we set the building up so that the entry sequence had, etched in metal on the exterior of the building, one of these sketches that was called Faith, that came from this conversation, this really deep conversation with the men. And so then we created an entry sequence above the main canopy that lights up and changes colors, color changing LEDs to sort of mark that they're coming home, that it's a chance to come home every night and see this beautiful piece about faith, which was one of the topics of conversation. And it creates this really striking entry sequence. And then as you pass through, we created some other artistic elements using reclaimed wood. One of the things that these guys learn is wood reclamation and architectural salvage. And so that was one of the industries that these guys were being trained to be able to do. And so we specifically purchased products from their warehouse that these guys had physically taken out of other buildings. We created a sculptural piece that lit up and changed colors and did all the things, sort of this portal that they enter through when they come home every day. And then Roger Cummings did these artistic flourishes and these panels on all the vertical surfaces as we go, from the main entry up to the second floor to the third floor. What greets you at the top of the stairs and the elevator is one of these big pieces that relates back to these specific conversations that the men had, that the men inspired, their conversations inspired this art. We created didactics to place on each artwork so that future generations of men who didn't participate in this know that there were men before them that helped create this work. And so the building started to brand itself, not by numbers and letters like the cell blocks and the things that the men had been forced into, but now each floor is branded by color, these bright colors, this artwork, artwork called acceptance, artwork called future change, artwork called love, artwork called faith, right? So the floors started to have these nicknames. Instead of the numbers, they started to be about the art. And so these are some of the really profound ways that buildings can really impact and affect the psyche. They can raise the level of care and concern, and they can show that people care about you, that they're wrapping their arms around you even when they're not there. Like, we've left this thing that continues to love, that continues to emanate positive energy in situations where a lot of people don't have much hope and don't have much positive energy in their lives. And so architecture can play a role. It can't solve everything, but it can definitely play a role in creating the types of environments and the types of situations that people can be motivated, inspired, and they can thrive.
That was extraordinary. James, the whole time you were speaking, I was imagining, without that extra effort, without the insight that you were able to gather, I mean, this building could have just been another prison, a less restrictive prison.
Yeah, like all the other ones, like all the ones that you compare it to that had been built. And one of the criticisms of us was that, oh, you guys are too young. You guys don't understand this. Oh, you haven't done this type of work before. Oh, you don't know. You don't know. It's like, yeah, we haven't done any crappy, half-ass, terrible buildings before. We've never done a bad building, and we're not going to start here. And just because there's all these limitations and the mentality of the people that have been creating this for people that generally don't look like me, generally for people who look like me, has been atrocious. And there hasn't been a connection. There hasn't been any questions asked. There hasn't been any real engagement done. There hasn't been any investigation done. There's been this stupid formulaic, whatever they did in prison. If they played basketball, then we put a basketball court there. If they had hard institutional flooring, ceramic tile surfaces because they're easy to clean and they're durable, and these guys we put wood there. We put, you know what I mean? We try to do the opposite. We try to do something warm. Because I said, what does your home look like? Do you have like hard tile all over your house, or do you have a wood floor when you come home? Oh, it's hard to maintain. I was like, well, here's some tips on wood floor maintenance. I can give you a tutorial. Like, I mean, we're not going to not do something that is supportive and sort of is an expression of love because, the maintenance guy doesn't know how to treat wood fly. We're not doing that anymore. You know what I mean? Because that is a formula for ending up with the exact same bullshit that, we've been stuck with before. So we're going to strike a new path. We're going to do a new thing. We're going to ask different questions. We're going to formulate different questions to ask, and then we're going to ask them. And then we are going to literally design with that knowledge of what we've now learned from these conversations that in these very close listening that we've done. We're going to design a better quality, a substantially qualitatively better building than what the last 10 shitty buildings that you're telling us that we don't have enough experience because we haven't done these shitty. Well, yeah, we haven't and we won't. And so this is where the new direction is. And we're just going to have to evolve. We're going to have to walk this new path. So yeah, that's Yeah, out with the old and in with the new.
I hope
We're
you
just
gave them lots of sunlight.
Oh, we did, and another that reminds me. There's another challenge was this notion of do they get operable windows or fixed windows? We designed operable windows, and that was a criticism. Oh, you can't give these guys operable. It's like why can't a free person, a free human being who's no longer incarcerated, why can't they decide that they want some fresh air and crack the window open like anybody else would in their oh well well what why so nobody could come up with a good reason why, and so we put operable windows in the room. There's at least one or two operable windows that you can crank open, let a little bit of air into every space. Another thing, we designed bathtubs. Bathtubs with shower surrounds into these, the little fiberglass deals. We put them in all the units so that the guys have a choice of whether they want to take a bath or want to take a shower. And at the last minute, people try to take that out, and they said, "Oh, well, these are guys. They only take showers. Guys don't take baths, so we should just take this out. We just put showers in." I said, "Well, no, these are human beings with a choice, and we're going to give them opportunities, every single opportunity for them to exercise their own free will. Now that they're not incarcerated, is a piece of healing that could be done, and it doesn't cost any more to have a tub surround mold fiberglass system or a shower surround fiberglass. Like there's the cost is negligible. The square footage, we're going to have 2 additional square feet in each room. We're going to make the closet 2 square feet bigger, or there's no substantial savings in cost. There's no substantial savings in space. There's no substantial additional maintenance or operation cost by doing this. This is the ethical thing to do. And I had to write like a full page letter to basically explain from an ethical standpoint why we are not in favor of taking tubs away from guys and giving them that choice. And, it was interesting when the building started to be populated. We were still doing some last minute punch list work, trying to get some things finished, but, guys were already moving in. And our project manager, Lissa Washington, who did a fabulous job on this project, she was there taking some notes, and she overheard a conversation of 2 guys in the hallway talking. And one of them said he felt like $1 million. He said he hasn't taken a shower in a decade, or a bath in a decade. And he said he took a bath last night and he just feels like $1 million. And she texted me and she said it was all worth it. The big fight was all worth it. Like if even one person feels like, wow, like I feel good about myself because I did something that I hadn't been able to do for a long time, that justifies that's the whole thing, giving free people an opportunity to make the same choices that everybody else makes. They had to stand on their feet and take showers when they were told when it was shower time every day for the last 20 years. So to not give them the choice to not have to do that, it's obscene. And so we just refuse to do it. And, little things like that can make as big a difference as the big things, right? We've got 122 solar panels on the roof producing clean energy. We've got all these things from a building science standpoint. We have, a modified rain screen system facade. We have all these, building performance things built into this as well, which we're very proud of. But the simple fact that people are able to choose between taking a bath and a shower for the first time in decades makes it all worth it. Like they can open a window in their apartment to get some fresh air if they want.
Yeah. It's really over. The message is it's really over. Yeah. This is finally over.
They can invite their kids to come in and hang out and play cards and play board games in a special room just for their kids. They can go outside and let the kids climb on a jungle gym like normal people. Like none of that would have happened had we just sort of taken the spreadsheet that was given to us and not ask those questions and begin to interact. And so I think we can really create qualitatively superior spaces, partially by formulating the right questions, by having the courage to ask those questions, and then by listening intently, and then doing something with that information, processing that and sort of integrating that into the design. I think these are just fundamental, basic human things that we should be doing. This should be normal. It should not be extraordinary, but unfortunately, it is quite extraordinary.
It's architecture as uh, an act of activism. The building itself, the choices you made in that building are an act of activism, which is it's just absolutely brilliant. I have to move on because there's a couple of other things that
Yes.
a couple of other areas I want to cover, but I could have talked about that all day. Let's talk about something really exciting: building envelopes. Um, so the envelope protects the occupants, but it also plays a role in connecting them to the natural world. And you know, for the people who are outside the building, the facade is the building, the community facing part. Is there any way you can help us to understand your process when designing the facade? What are the factors that you consider?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a number of factors for me that are equally important. Again, the three pillars or tenets of formula is sustainability, technology, and art. And so those things pass through the entire design process. They permeate the interior of the building. They express themselves on the exterior of the building, right? So any technologies that we can use, one of the big technologies, the advanced rain screen technology, I mean, that is, I think, revolutionary in terms of keeping water out, keeping buildings dry, regulating the pressure behind the facade. I mean, little things like that. And sometimes you can do a modified rain screen system with, vertical furring and, being able to push your insulation to the exterior. And, in our climates up here in the north, we have continuous insulation requirements because of energy efficiency goals. And, we can find ways to get insulation outboard. And then if we can even the slightest amount of furring to be able to then get your facade system outbound and then with an airspace between, that insulation and, the glazing, that makes a huge difference in terms of building performance from a thermal benefit standpoint, but also passing the dew points. Dew points passing through buildings is one of the biggest reasons why we end up having, mold and, sick building syndrome, where you can't see it, right? The mold, because of the way that the moisture passes through the building when the insulation is in the wall rather than sort of outboard, you start to have these differentials. And, if it's -10 outside and it's 70 inside, somewhere it's going to be 32 and somewhere moisture is going to form. So being able to push that out and be able to have that happen sort of outside and then be able to sort of drain that, dry that out before it gets into the walls is incredibly important in terms of creating buildings that don't build up mold and, all these indoor pollutants and whatnot. I think that building technology it's advanced to the point now where there's a lot of things that we should just be doing standard, right? We should just be pushing that outboard standard and working with physics and not against it. So that is super important. That is something that we want to make standard. That's just standard fare as we approach buildings in this climate. The second piece is being able to use facade systems that, again, we do very well in this generation with the technology that we have. All manner of fiber cement systems. There's some really good ones out there. We use Nichiha a lot. It's one of the systems, rain screen systems that we like. They come in a number of different colors. There's custom colors that we've been able to do and achieve. It's a really, really solid system, and there's a number of other similar systems that can also achieve similar goals. But it allows color variation. It allows you to be able to interplay panel gradations and colors and things, and it's just a really solid system. We do a lot with dry design and other metal panel systems. They're able to be perforated when the metal panel is not the sort of insulated wall, when the insulated wall is happening behind it, and the metal panels are now functioning in a rain screen capacity. Being able to perforate them, being able to do different hole patterns and hole depths, you can start to create art. You can transfer photos. You can do all amazing things, right? So there's things that we couldn't do in the past that are now possible with the technology that we have. And there's a lot of things in the past that were awesome that we've kind of lost that we really can't do anymore, right? So being able to know what is what and being able to have everything in your arsenal and being able to choose the type of expression that best matches the aspirations of the client, of the history of the community, the context of the built environment around it. Those are the types of things that we always look to explore and we look to try to do. So being able to marry the technology with the sustainability and then create an artistic opportunity to say something really important to the community about who this client is, who the people that are going to be inhabiting this space is. We think that should be standard fare. That should be baked into the pie for architects moving forward.
Fantastic. Oh, just fantastic. Okay. You and Nate, I think it was, won an AIA gold medal in 2020.
Yes, we earned gold medals, which was an amazing honor.
Congratulations on that. Was it for a particular project, or is that a lifetime achievement? How does that work?
It's sort of a lifetime achievement. It's something, the secret formula to who is nominated and, who is awarded a gold medal it's different in every state. And Minnesota has its own process. And as a gold medalist, now I've had the opportunity to participate in that process for our most recent gold medalist. And it's kind of a secret sauce, but it's kind of a combination of contributions to the profession, extraordinary contributions to the profession. It's sort of a lifetime achievement. It's just a combination of different factors. And I think really it comes down to impact and being able to leave a lasting impact that will hopefully inspire and has motivated and has educated, future generations, or will educate future generations.
Yeah, fantastic. All right. I have to ask the question that I ask every guest, and you answer it from whatever perspective you see fit. Okay. What makes a great building?
That's a good question. I think that great buildings are buildings that move people and have an effect on people, on the way that they feel, without them knowing why. I think a great building is something that is self-evident. It is something that opens itself up and offers itself to the people that approach it and that enter it and that experience it. And that there are sort of subliminal qualities that touch emotions, whether it's just an amazing use of daylight, whether it's an incredible use of artificial light, whether it's texture, color, any number of different factors. A great building is something that it really leaves an impression on folks, and especially on folks that don't have the vocabulary to be able to describe what it is, but they feel something, and they feel something good that they can't explain, but it's there, it's palpable. Those to me are great buildings. And I think every generation has great buildings. And one of my missions, and I think our mission at Formula, is to bring great buildings to just the average person. A lot of times great buildings take lots of money and lots of resources to construct. And they're generally constructed, the architects with the most skills and the most talent, the most sought after talent, usually go to the highest bidder and do work for We're sort of a tool of sort of the aristocracy in a lot of ways, right? Formula endeavors to be um, sort of an extension of maybe the proletariat, right? Of regular folk, of the types of buildings. I mean, we're working on a community food site, which will be the largest food shelf in Twin Cities. It's open, and we're just finishing the facade. Probably tomorrow, the facade will be completely finished, and signage will be going up. But it affects folks who are food insecure and brings what I think, and I'm biased, but beautiful architecture. We created this cantilevered canopy, this colorful canopy that has translucent solar panels integrated into it as sort of the main entry. The side that faces the street and the light rail and all the traffic. We had Roger Cummings come in and do this incredible mural that really greets people and sort of wraps around the building and brings them into the rear where the main entry, the ADA entry and access is. People are already commenting and texting me and telling me that they're just inspired every day when they go past this incredible facade on the train or riding their bike or walking past. These buildings were abandoned for years, or one of them was just in disrepair. These are 100-year-old buildings, and we were able to completely gut them and renovate them on a very tight budget and create a few flourishes and sort of very colorful sort of exclamation points that people in the community are, really feeling uplifted by. And so, I mean, bringing top-notch design, building science, building technology, and art to regular folks, folks who, enter Juxtaposition Arts, an art center dedicated to kids on the north side of Minneapolis, many of whom are coming from challenging home environments, but bringing beautiful, customized, high-level design to places where regular folks can touch it, can experience it, can be uplifted by it, I think is the most rewarding part of what we do. We're not architects of sort of the ivory tower or the gilded house. We don't do multi-million dollar mansions out on lakefront land out in the suburbs. We really look to reclaim urban spaces and bring incredible top-notch design to where it can actually touch and affect just regular people that are in the neighborhoods that we grew up in, and really beautifying the places that that help hold us up and raise us.
That's amazing. James, before we go, is there anything that you'd like to promote, any exciting news that you'd like to share with our listeners for your firm, for you personally?
No, no real self-promotion. Follow us, check us out. We are out here serving the good of the community every single day and trying to uplift and do the best possible thing that we can with the budgets and the time and the talent that we have available. And that's it in a nutshell. That's who we are.
Well, it was truly extraordinary listening to you speak, James. I can't thank you enough for your time. Thanks for being here, and take care.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.